Chapter 1 of The Lost Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tony Foster. The Lost Girl by D.H.Lawrence. Chapter 1. The Decline of Manchester House. Take a mining townlet like Woodhouse, with a population of 10,000 people, and 3 generations behind it. This space of 3 generations argues a certain well-established society. The old county has fled from the sight of so much disembowelled coal to flourish on mineral rights in regions still idyllic. Remains one great and inaccessible magnate, the local coal owner, 3 generations old, and clambering on the bottom step of the county, kicking off the mass below. Rule him out. A well-established society in Woodhouse, full of fine shades, ranging from the dark of coal dust to grit of stonemason and sawdust of timber merchant, through the lustre of lard and butter and meat, to the perfume of the chemist and the disinfectant of the doctor, on to the serene gold tarnish of bank managers, cashiers for the firm, clergymen and such like, as far as the automobile refulgence of the general manager of all the collieries. Here the ne plus ultra. The general manager lives in the shrubberied seclusion of the so-called manor. The genuine hall, abandoned by the county, has been taken over as offices by the firm. Here we are then. A vast substratum of colliers, a thick sprinkling of tradespeople intermingled with small employers of labour, and diversified by elementary schoolmasters and nonconformist clergy. A higher layer of bank managers, rich millers and well-to-do ironmasters. Episcopal clergy and the managers of colliers. Then the rich and sticky cherry of the local coal owner glistening over all. Such the complicated social system of a small industrial town in the Midlands of England in this year of grace 1920. But let us go back a little. Such it was in the last calm year of plenty, 1913. A calm year of plenty. But one chronic and dreary malady, that of the odd women. Why, in the name of all prosperity, should every class but the lowest in such a society hang overburdened with Dead Sea fruit of odd women, unmarried, unmarriageable women, called old maids? Why is it that every tradesman, every schoolmaster, every bank manager and every clergyman produces 1, 2, 3 or more old maids? Do the middle classes, particularly the lower middle classes, give birth to more girls than boys? Or do the lower middle class men assiduously climb up or down in marriage, thus leaving their true partners stranded? Or are middle class women very squeamish in their choice of husbands? However it be, it is a tragedy. Or perhaps it is not. Perhaps these unmarried women of the middle classes are the famous, sexless workers of our ant-industrial society, of which we hear so much. Perhaps all they lack is an occupation, in short, a job. But perhaps we might hear their own opinion, before we lay the law down. In Woodhouse there was a terrible crop of old maid among the nobs, the tradespeople and the clergy. The whole town of women, colliers' wives and all, held its breath as it saw a chance of one of these daughters of comfort and woe getting off. They flocked to the well-to-do weddings with an intoxication of relief. For let class jealousy be what it may, a woman hates to see another woman left stalely on the shelf without a chance. They all wanted the middle-class girls to find husbands. Every one wanted it, including the girls themselves. Hence the dismalness. Now James Houghton had only one child, his daughter Alvina. Surely Alvina Houghton. But let us retreat to the early 80s, when Alvina was a baby, or even further back, to the palmy days of James Houghton. In his palmy days, James Houghton was crème de la crème of Woodhouse society. The house of Houghton had always been well-to-do, tradespeople, we must admit, but after a few generations of affluence, tradespeople acquire a distinct cachet. Now James Houghton, at the age of 28, inherited a splendid business in Manchester goods in Woodhouse. He was a tall, thin, elegant young man with side whiskers, genuinely refined, somewhat in the Bulwer style. He had a taste for elegant conversation and elegant literature and elegant Christianity. A tall, thin, brittle young man, rather fluttering in his manner, full of facile ideas, and with a beautiful speaking voice, most beautiful. Withal, of course, a tradesman. He courted a small dark woman, older than himself, daughter of a Derbyshire squire. He expected to get at least £10,000 with her, in which he was disappointed, for he only got 800. Being of a romantic commercial nature, he never forgave her, but always treated her with the most elegant courtesy. To see him peel and prepare an apple for her was an exquisite sight. But that peeled and quartered apple was her portion. This elegant Adam of commerce gave Eve her own back, nicely cored, and had no more to do with her. Meanwhile, Alvina was born. Before all this, however, before his marriage, James Houghton had built Manchester House. It was a vast square building, vast, that is, for Woodhouse, standing on the main street and high road of the small but growing town. The lower front consisted of 2 fine shops, one for Manchester goods, one for silk and woollens. This was James Houghton's commercial poem. For James Houghton was a dreamer, and something of a poet, commercial, be it understood. He liked the novels of George MacDonald and the fantasies of that author extremely. He wove one continual fantasy for himself, a fantasy of commerce. He dreamed of silks and poplins, luscious in texture and of unforeseen exquisiteness. He dreamed of carriages of the county arrested before his windows, of exquisite women ruffling, charmed, entranced to his counter. And charming, entrancing, he served them his lovely fabrics, which only he and they could sufficiently appreciate. His fame spread, until Alexandra, Princess of Wales, and Elizabeth, Empress of Austria, the 2 best-dressed women in Europe, floated down from heaven to the shop in Woodhouse, and sallied forth to show what could be done by purchasing from James Houghton. We cannot say why James Houghton failed to become the Liberty or the Snelgrove of his day. Perhaps he had too much imagination. Be that as it may, in those early days when he brought his wife to her new home, his window on the Manchester side was a foam and a May blossom of muslins and prints. His window on the London side was an autumn evening of silks and rich fabrics. What wife could fail to be dazzled? But she, poor darling, from her stone hall in stony Derbyshire, was a little bit repulsed by the man's dancing in front of his stock, like David before the ark. The home to which he brought her was a monument. In the great bedroom over the shop he had his furniture built of solid mahogany, oh, too solid. No doubt he hopped or skipped himself with satisfaction into the monstrous matrimonial bed. It could only be mounted by means of a stool and chair. But the poor, secluded little woman, older than he, must have climbed up with a heavy heart, to lie and face the gloomy Bastille of mahogany, the great cupboard opposite, or to turn wearily sideways to the great cheval mirror, which performed a perpetual and hideous bow before her grace. Such furniture! It could never be removed from the room. The little child was born in the 2nd year, and then James Houghton decamped to a small, half-furnished bedroom at the other end of the house, where he slept on a rough board and played the anchorite for the rest of his days. His wife was left alone with her baby and the built-in furniture. She developed heart disease as a result of nervous repressions. But, like a butterfly, James fluttered over his fabrics. He was a tyrant to his shop girls. No French marquis in a Dickens novel could have been more elegant and raffiné and heartless. The girls detested him, and yet his curious refinement and enthusiasm bore them away. They submitted to him. The shop attracted much curiosity, but the poor-spirited Woodhouse people were weak buyers. They wearied James Houghton with their demands for common zephyrs, for red flannel which they would scallop with black worsted, for black alpacas and bombazines and merinos. He fluffed out his silk-striped muslins, his India cotton prints, but the natives shied off as if he had offered them the poisoned robes of Heracles. There was a sale. These sales contributed a good deal to Mrs. Houghton's nervous heart disease. They brought the first signs of wear and tear into the face of James Houghton. At first, of course, he merely marked down, with discretion, his less expensive stock of prints and muslins, nun's veiling and muslin de Laine, with a few fancy braidings and trimmings in guimpe or bronze to enliven the affair, and Woodhouse bought cautiously. After the sale, however, James Houghton felt himself at liberty to plunge into an orgy of new stock. He flitted, with a tense look on his face, to Manchester. After which huge bundles, bales and boxes arrived in Woodhouse, and were dumped on the pavement of the shop. Friday evening came, and with it a revelation in Houghton's window, the first piquets, the first strangely woven and honeycombed toilet covers and bed quilts, the first frill caps and aprons for maidservants, a wonder in white, that was how James advertised it, a wonder in white. Who knows but that he had been reading Wilkie Collins' famous novel? As the 9 days of the wonder in white passed and receded, James disappeared in the direction of London. A few Fridays later he came out with his winter touch. Weird and wonderful winter coats, for ladies. Everything James handled was for ladies, he scorned the coarser sex. Weird and wonderful winter coats for ladies, of thick, black, pock-marked cloth, stood and flourished their bare fur cuffs in the background, while tippets, boas, muffs, and winter fancies coquetted in front of the window space. Friday night crowds gathered outside. The gas lamps shone their brightest. James Houghton hovered in the background like an author on his first night in the theatre. The result was a sensation. 10 villages stared and crushed round the plate glass. It was a sensation, but what a sensation! In the breasts of the crowd, wonder, admiration, fear, and ridicule. Let us stress the word fear. The inhabitants of Woodhouse were afraid lest James Houghton should impose his standards upon them. His goods were in excellent taste, but his customers were in as bad taste as possible. They stood outside and pointed, giggled and jeered. Poor James, like an author on his first night, saw his work fall more than flat. But still he believed in his own excellence, and quite justly. What he failed to perceive was that the crowd hated excellence. Woodhouse wanted a gently graduated progress in mediocrity, a mediocrity so stale and flat that it fell outside the imagination of any sensitive mortal. Woodhouse wanted a series of vulgar little thrills, as one tawdry mediocrity was imported from Nottingham or Birmingham to take the place of some tawdry mediocrity which Nottingham and Birmingham had already discarded. That Woodhouse, as a very condition of its own being, hated any approach to originality or real taste, this James Houghton could never learn. He thought he had not been clever enough, when he had been far, far too clever already. He always thought that Dame Fortune was a capricious and fastidious dame, a sort of Elizabeth of Austria or Alexandra, Princess of Wales, elegant beyond his grasp. Whereas Dame Fortune, even in London or Vienna, let alone in Woodhouse, was a vulgar woman of the middle and lower middle class, ready to put her heavy foot on anything that was not vulgar, machine-made, and appropriate to the herd. When he saw his delicate originalities, as well as his faint flourishes of draper's fantasy, squashed flat under the calm and solid foot of vulgar Dame Fortune, he fell into fits of depression bordering on mysticism, and talked to his wife in a vague way of higher influences and the angel Israfel. She, poor lady, was thoroughly scared by Israfel, and completely unhooked by the vagaries of James. At last, we hurry down the slopes of James' misfortunes. The real days of Houghton's great sales began. Houghton's great bargain events were really events. After some years of hanging on, he let go splendidly. He marked down his prints, his chintzes, his dimities, and his veilings with a grand and lavish hand. Bang went his blue pencil through 3 and 11, and nobly he subscribed 1 shilling and 3 farthings. Prices fell like nuts. A lofty 1 and 11 rolled down to 6.3. 1 and 6 magically shrank into 4pence 3 farthings, whilst good solid prints exposed themselves at 3pence 3 farthings per yard. Now this was really an opportunity. Moreover, the goods, having become a little stale during their years of ineffectuality, were beginning to approximate to the public taste. And besides, good sound stuff it was, no matter what the pattern. And so the little Woodhouse girls went to school in petties and drawers made of material which James had destined for fair summer dresses. Petties and drawers of which the little Woodhouse girls were ashamed, for all that. For if they should chance to turn up their little skirts, be sure they would raise a chorus among their companions. "Yah, you've got your Houghton's threepenny drawers on." All this time James Houghton walked on air. He still saw the Fata Morgana snatching his fabrics round her lovely form, and pointing him to wealth untold. True, he became also superintendent of the Sunday school. But whether this was an act of vanity, or whether it was an attempt to establish an entente cordiale with higher powers, who shall judge? Meanwhile his wife became more and more an invalid. The little Alvina was a pretty, growing child. Woodhouse was really impressed by the sight of Mrs. Houghton, small, pale and withheld, taking a walk with her dainty little girl, so fresh in an ermine tippet and a muff. Mrs. Houghton in a shiny black bear's fur, the child in the white and spotted ermine, passing silent and shadowy down the street, made an impression which the people did not forget. But Mrs. Houghton had pains at her heart. If during her walk she saw 2 little boys having a scrimmage, she had to run to them with pence and entreaty, leaving them dumbfounded, whilst she leaned blue at the lips against the wall. If she saw a carter crack his whip over the ears of the horse as the horse laboured uphill, she had to cover her eyes and avert her face, and all her strength left her. So she stayed more and more in her room, and the child was given to the charge of a governess. Miss Frost was a handsome, vigorous young woman of about 30 years of age, with grey-white hair and gold-rimmed spectacles. The white hair was not at all tragical, it was a family trait. Miss Frost mattered more than anyone else to Alvina Houghton, during the first long 25 years of the girl's life. The governess was a strong, generous woman, a musician by nature. She had a sweet voice, and sang in the choir of the chapel, and took the first class of girls in the Sunday school, of which James Houghton was superintendent. She disliked and rather despised James Houghton, saw in him elements of a hypocrite, detested his airy and gracious selfishness, his lack of human feeling, and most of all, his fairy fantasy. As James went further into life he became a dreamer. Sad indeed that he died before the days of Freud. He enjoyed the most wonderful and fairy-like dreams, which he could describe perfectly in charming, delicate language. At such times his beautifully modulated voice all but sang. His grey eyes gleamed fiercely under his bushy, hairy eyebrows. His pale face with its side whiskers had a strange lure. His long, thin hands fluttered occasionally. He had become meagre in figure. His skimpy but genteel coat would be buttoned over his breast as he recounted his dream adventures. Adventures that were half Edgar Allan Poe, half Anderson, with touches of Vathek and Lord Byron and George MacDonald. Perhaps more than a touch of the last. Ladies were always struck by these accounts. But Miss Frost never felt so strongly moved to impatience as when she was within hearing. For 20 years she and James Houghton treated each other with a courteous distance. Sometimes she broke into open impatience with him. Sometimes he answered her tartly, "Indeed, indeed, oh indeed, well, I'm sorry to find it so," as if the injury consisted in her finding it so. Then he would flit away to the Conservative Club with a fleet, light, hurried step, as if pressed by fate. At the club he played chess, at which he was excellent, and conversed. Then he flitted back at 12:30 to dinner. The whole morale of the house rested immediately on Miss Frost. She saw her line in the first year. She must defend the little Alvina, whom she loved as her own, and the nervous, petulant, heart-stricken woman, the mother, from the vagaries of James. Not that James had any vices. He did not drink or smoke, was abstemious and clean as an anchorite, and never lowered his fine tone. But still, the two unprotected ones must be sheltered from him. Miss Frost imperceptibly took into her hands the reins of the domestic government. Her rule was quiet, strong, and generous. She was not seeking her own way. She was steering the poor domestic ship of Manchester House, illuminating its dark rooms with her own sure, radiant presence. Her silver-white hair and her pale, heavy, reposeful face seemed to give off a certain radiance. She seemed to give weight, ballast, and repose to the staggering and bewildered home. She controlled the maid, and suggested the meals which James ate without knowing what he ate. She brought in flowers and books, and very rarely a visitor. Visitors were out of place in the dark sombreness of Manchester House. Her flowers charmed the petulant invalid. Her books she sometimes discussed with the airy James, after which discussions she was invariably filled with exasperation and impatience, whilst James invariably retired to the shop, and was heard raising his musical voice, which the work-girls hated, to one or other of the work-girls. James certainly had an irritating way of speaking of a book. He talked of incidents and effects and suggestions, as if the whole thing had just been a sensational aesthetic attribute to himself. Not a grain of human feeling in the man, said Miss Frost, flushing pink with exasperation. She herself invariably took the human line. Meanwhile the shops began to take on a hopeless and frowsy look. After 10 years' sales, spring sales, summer sales, autumn sales, winter sales, James began to give up the drapery dream. He himself could not bear any more to put the heavy, pock-holed black cloth coat with wild bear cuffs and collar onto the stand. He had marked it down from 5 guineas to 1 guinea, and then, oh, ignoble day, to 10 and 6. He nearly kissed the gipsy woman with a basket of tin saucepan lids when at last she bought it for 5 shillings at the end of one of his winter sales. But even she, in spite of the bitter, sleety day, would not put the coat on in the shop. She carried it over her arm down to the Miners' Arms, and later, with a shock that really hurt him, James, peeping bird-like out of his shop door, saw her sitting driving a dirty rag-and-bone cart with a green-white mouldy pony, and flourishing her arms like some wild and hairy decorated squaw. For the long bear fur, wet with sleet, seemed like a chevaux de frise of long porcupine quills round her forearms and her neck. Yet such good, such wonderful material! James eyed it for one moment, then fled like a rabbit to the stove in his back regions. The higher powers did not seem to fulfil the terms of treaty which James hoped for. He began to back out from the Entente. The Sunday school was a great trial to him. Instead of being carried away by his grace and eloquence, the nasty louts of colliery boys and girls openly banged their feet, and made deafening noises when he tried to speak. He said many acid and withering things as he stood there on the rostrum. But what is the good of saying acid things to those little fiends and gall-bladders, the colliery children? The situation was saved by Miss Frost sweeping together all the big girls under her surveillance, and by her organising that the tall and handsome blacksmith who taught the lower boys should extend his influence over the upper boys. His influence was more than effectual. It consisted in gripping any recalcitrant boy just above the knee, and jesting with him in a jocular manner in the dialect. The blacksmith's hand was all a blacksmith's hand need be, and his dialect was as broad as could be wished. Between the grip and the homely idiom no boy could endure without squealing. So the Sunday school paid more attention to James, whose prayers were beautiful. But then one of the boys, a protégé of Miss Frost, having been left for half an hour in the obscure room with Mrs. Houghton, gave away the secret of the blacksmith's grip, which secret so haunted the poor lady that it marked a stage in the increase of her malady, and made Sunday afternoon a nightmare to her. And then James Houghton resented something in the coarse Scotch manner of the minister of that day, so that the superintendency of the Sunday school came to an end. At the same time, Solomon had to divide his baby. That is, he let the London side of his shop to W.H. Johnson, the tailor and haberdasher, a parvenu little fellow whose English would not bear analysis. Bitter as it was, it had to be. Carpenters and joiners appeared, and the premises were completely severed. From her room in the shadows at the back, the invalid heard the hammering and sawing, and suffered. W.H. Johnson came out with a spick and span window, and had his wife, a shrewd quiet woman, and his daughter, a handsome loud girl, to help him on Friday evenings. Men flocked in, even women, buying their husbands a sixpence halfpenny tie. They could have bought a tie for 4.3 from James Houghton, but no, they would rather give sixpence halfpenny for W.H. Johnson's fresh but rubbishy stuff. And James, who had tried to rise to another successful sale, saw the streams pass into the other doorway, and heard the heavy feet on the hollow boards of the other shop, his shop no more. After this cut at his pride and integrity, he lay in retirement for a while, mystically inclined. Probably he would have come to Swedenborg had not his clipped wings spread for a new flight. He hit upon the brilliant idea of working up his derelict fabrics into ready-mades. Not men's clothes, oh no, women's, or rather ladies'. Ladies' tailoring, said the new announcement. James Houghton was happy once more. A zigzag wooden stairway was rigged up in the high back of Manchester House. In the great lofts, sewing machines of various patterns and movements were installed. A manageress was advertised for, and work girls were hired. So a new phase of life started. At 6:30 in the morning there was a clatter of feet and of girls' excited tongues along the back yard and up the wooden stairway outside the back wall. The poor invalid heard every clack and every vibration. She could never get over her nervous apprehension of an invasion. Every morning alike she felt an invasion of some enemy was breaking in on her. And all day long the low, steady rumble of sewing machines overhead seemed like the low drumming of a bombardment upon her weak heart. To make matters worse, James Houghton decided that he must have his sewing machines driven by some extra-human force. He installed another plant of machinery, acetylene or some such contrivance, which was intended to drive all the little machines from one big belt. Hence a further throbbing and shaking in the upper regions, truly terrible to endure. But fortunately or unfortunately, the acetylene plant was not a success. Girls got their thumbs pierced, and sewing machines absolutely refused to stop sewing once they had started, and absolutely refused to start once they had been stopped. So that after a while one loft was reserved for disused and rusty, but expensive engines. Dame Fortune, who had refused to be taken by fine fabrics and fancy trimmings, was just as reluctant to be captured by ready-mades. Again the good dame was thoroughly lower middle class. James Houghton designed robes. Now robes were the mode. Perhaps it was Alexandra, Princess of Wales, who gave glory to the slim, glove-fitting princess robe. Be that as it may, James Houghton designed robes. His work girls, a race even more callous than shop girls, proclaimed the fact that James tried on his own inventions upon his own elegant thin person, before the privacy of his own cheval mirror. And even if he did, why not? Miss Frost, hearing this legend, looked sideways at the enthusiast. Let us remark in time that Miss Frost had already ceased to draw any maintenance from James Houghton. Far from it. She herself contributed to the upkeep of the domestic hearth and board. She had fully decided never to leave her two charges. She knew that a governess was an impossible item in Manchester House, as things went. And so she trudged the country, giving music lessons to the daughters of tradesmen and of colliers who boasted pianofortes. She even taught heavy-handed but dauntless colliers who were seized with a passion to play. Miles she trudged on her round from village to village, a white-haired woman with a long, quick stride, a strong figure, and a quick, handsome smile when once her face awoke behind her gold-rimmed glasses. Like many short-sighted people, she had a certain intent look of one who goes her own way. The miners knew her, and entertained the highest respect and admiration for her. As they streamed in a grimy stream home from pit, they diverged like some magic dark river from off the pavement into the horseway to give her room as she approached. And the men who knew her well enough to salute her by calling her name, "Miss Frost," giving it the proper intonation of salute, were fussy men indeed. "She's a lady if ever there was one," they said, and they meant it. Hearing her name, poor Miss Frost would flash a smile and a nod from behind her spectacles, but whose black face she smiled to she never or rarely knew. If she did chance to get an inkling, then gladly she called in reply, "Mr. Lamb," or "Mr. Calladine." In her way she was a proud woman, for she was regarded with cordial respect, touched with veneration, by at least 1,000 colliers, and by perhaps as many colliers' wives. That is something, for any woman. Miss Frost charged 15 shillings for 13 weeks' lessons, 2 lessons a week. And at that she was considered rather dear. She was supposed to be making money. What money she made went chiefly to support the Houghton household. In the meanwhile she drilled Alvina thoroughly in theory and pianoforte practice, for Alvina was naturally musical, and besides this she imparted to the girl the elements of a young lady's education, including the drawing of flowers in water-colour and the translation of a Lamartine poem. Now, incredible as it may seem, fate threw another prop to the falling house of Houghton, in the person of the manageress of the work-girls, Miss Pinnegar. James Houghton complained of fortune. Yet to what other man would fortune have sent 2 such women as Miss Frost and Miss Pinnegar gratis? Yet there they were, and doubtful if James was ever grateful for their presence. If Miss Frost saved them from heaven knows what domestic debacle and horror, Miss Pinnegar saved him from the workhouse. Let us not mince matters. For a dozen years Miss Frost supported the heart-stricken, nervous invalid, Clarice Houghton. For more than 20 years she cherished, tended and protected the young Alvina, shielding the child alike from a neurotic mother and a father such as James. For nearly 20 years she saw that food was set on the table, and clean sheets were spread on the beds, and all the time remained virtually in the position of an outsider, without one grain of established authority. And then to find Miss Pinnegar! In her way Miss Pinnegar was very different from Miss Frost. She was a rather short, stout, mouse-coloured, creepy kind of woman, with a high colour in her cheeks, and dun, close hair like a cap. It was evident she was not a lady. Her grammar was not without reproach. She had pale grey eyes, and a padding step, and a soft voice, and almost purplish cheeks. Mrs. Houghton, Miss Frost, and Alvina did not like her. They suffered her unwillingly. But from the first she had a curious ascendancy over James Houghton. One would have expected his aesthetic eye to be offended. But no doubt it was her voice, her soft, near, sure voice, which seemed almost like a secret touch upon her hearer. Now many of her hearers disliked being secretly touched, as if it were beneath their clothing. Miss Frost abhorred it, so did Mrs. Houghton. Miss Frost's voice was clear and straight as a bell-note, open as the day. Yet Alvina, though in loyalty she adhered to her beloved Miss Frost, did not really mind the quiet, suggestive power of Miss Pinnegar. For Miss Pinnegar was not vulgarly insinuating. On the contrary, the things she said were rather clumsy and downright. It was only that she seemed to weigh what she said, secretly, before she said it, and then she approached as if she would slip it into her hearer's consciousness without his being aware of it. She seemed to slide her speeches unnoticed into one's ears, so that one accepted them without the slightest challenge. That was just her manner of approach. In her own way, she was as loyal and unselfish as Miss Frost. There are such poles of opposition between honesties and loyalties. Miss Pinnegar had the second class of girls in the Sunday school, and she took second subservient place in Manchester House. By force of nature, Miss Frost took first place. Only when Miss Pinnegar spoke to Mr. Houghton, nay, the very way she addressed herself to him, "What do you think, Mr. Houghton?" Then there seemed to be assumed an immediacy of correspondence between the two, and an unquestioned priority in their unison, his and hers, which was a cruel thorn in Miss Frost's outspoken breast. This sort of secret intimacy, and secret exulting in having, really, the chief power, was most repugnant to the white-haired woman. Not that there was, in fact, any secrecy or any form of unwarranted correspondence between James Houghton and Miss Pinnegar. Far from it. Each of them would have found any suggestion of such a possibility repulsive in the extreme. It was simply an implicit correspondence between their two psyches, an immediacy of understanding which preceded all expression, tacit, wireless. Miss Pinnegar lived in, so that the household consisted of the invalid who mostly sat in her black dress with a white lace collar fastened by a twisted gold brooch, in her own dim room, doing nothing, nervous and heart-suffering. Then James, and the thin young Alvina, who adhered to her beloved Miss Frost, and then these two strange women. Miss Pinnegar never lifted up her voice in household affairs. She seemed, by her silence, to admit her own inadequacy in culture and intellect, when topics of interest were being discussed, only coming out now and then with defiant platitudes and truisms, for almost defiantly she took the commonplace, vulgarian point of view, yet after everything she would turn with her quiet, triumphant assurance to James Houghton, and start on some point of business, soft, assured, ascendant. The others shut their ears. Now Miss Pinnegar had to get her footing slowly. She had to let James run the gamut of his creations. Each Friday night new wonders, robes and ladies' suits, the phrase was very new, garnished the window of Houghton's shop. It was one of the sights of the place. Houghton's window on Friday night. Young or old, no individual, certainly no female, left Woodhouse without spending an excited and usually hilarious 10 minutes on the pavement under the window. Muffled shrieks of young damsels who had just got their first view, guffaws of sympathetic youths, continued giggling and expostulation and "Hey, but what price the umbrella skirt, my girl?" and "You'd like to marry me in that, my boy, what? Not half?" Or else, "Hey, nah, if you'd seen me in that, you'd have fallen in love with me at first sight, shouldn't you?" With the probable answer, "I should have fallen over myself making haste to get away." Loud guffaws. All this was the regular Friday night's entertainment in Woodhouse. James Houghton's shop was regarded as a weekly comic issue. His piqué costumes with glass buttons and sort of steel trimming collars and cuffs were immortal. But why, once more, drag it out? Miss Pinnegar served in the shop on Friday nights. She stood by her man. Sometimes when the shrieks grew loudest she came to the shop door and looked with her pale grey eyes at the ridiculous mob of lasses in tam-o'-shanters and youths half buried in caps, and she imposed a silence. They edged away. Meanwhile Miss Pinnegar pursued the sober and even tenor of her own way. Whilst James lashed out, to use the local phrase, in robes and suits, Miss Pinnegar steadily ground away, producing strong, indestructible shirts and singlets for the colliers, sound, serviceable aprons for the colliers' wives, good print dresses for servants, and so on. She executed no flights of fancy. She had her goods made to suit her people. And so, underneath the foam and froth of James' creative adventure flowed a slow but steady stream of output and income. The women of Woodhouse came at last to depend on Miss Pinnegar. Growing lads in the pit reduced their garments to shreds with amazing expedition. "I'll go to Miss Pinnegar for thy shirts this time, my lad," said the harassed mothers, "and see if they'll stand thee." It was almost like a threat, but it served Manchester House. James bought very little stock in these days, just remnants and pieces for his immortal robes. It was Miss Pinnegar who saw the travellers and ordered the unions and calicoes and grey flannel. James hovered round and said the last word, of course. But what was his last word but an echo of Miss Pinnegar's penultimate? He was not interested in unions and twills. His own stock remained on hand. Time, like a slow whirlpool, churned it over into sight and out of sight, like a mass of dead seaweed in a backwash. There was a regular series of sales fortnightly. The display of creations fell off. The new entertainment was the Friday night sale. James would attack some portion of his stock, make a wild jumble of it, spend a delirious Wednesday and Thursday marking down, and then open on Friday afternoon. In the evening there was a crush. A good moiré underskirt for 1 11/3 was not to be neglected, and a handsome string lace collarette for 6/3 would iron out and be worth at least 3 6. That was how it went. It would nearly all of it iron out into something really nice, poor James' crumpled stock. His fine, semi-transparent face flushed pink. His eyes flashed as he took in the sixpences and handed back knots of tape or packets of pins for the notorious farthings. What matter if the farthing change had originally cost him a halfpenny? His shop was crowded with women peeping and pawing and turning things over and commenting in loud, unfeeling tones. For there were still many comic items. Once, for example, he suddenly heaped up piles of hats, trimmed and untrimmed, the weirdest, sauciest, most screaming shapes. Woodhouse enjoyed itself that night. And all the time, in her quiet, polite, think-the-more fashion, Miss Pinnegar waited on the people, showing them considerable forbearance and just a tinge of contempt. She became very tired those evenings. Her hair, under its invisible hairnet, became flatter, her cheeks hung down purplish and mottled. But while James stood, she stood. The people did not like her, yet she influenced them. And the stock slowly wilted, withered. Some was scrapped. The shop seemed to have digested some of its indigestible contents. James accumulated sixpences in a miserly fashion. Luckily for her work girls, Miss Pinnegar took her own orders, and received payments for her own productions. Some of her regular customers paid her 1 a week, or less. But it made a small, steady income. She reserved her own modest share, paid the expenses of her department, and left the residue to James. James had accumulated sixpences, and made a little space in his shop. He had desisted from creations. Time now for a new flight. He decided it was better to be a manufacturer than a tradesman. His shop, already only half its original size, was again too big. It might be split once more. Rents had risen in Woodhouse. Why not cut off another shop from his premises? No sooner said than done. In came the architect, with whom he had played many a game of chess. Best, said the architect, take off one good-sized shop, rather than halve the premises. James would be left a little cramped, a little tight, with only 1/3 of his present space, but as we age, we dwindle. More hammering and alterations, and James found himself cooped in a long, narrow shop, very dark at the back, with a high oblong window and a door that came in at a pinched corner. Next door to him was a cheerful new grocer of the cheap and florid type. The new grocer whistled "Just Like the Ivy," and shouted boisterously to his shop boy. In his doorway, protruding on James's sensitive vision, was a pyramid of sixpence halfpenny tins of salmon, red, shiny tins with pink halved salmons depicted, and another yellow pyramid of fourpence halfpenny tins of pineapple. Bacon dangled in pale rolls, almost over James's doorway, whilst straw and paper, redolent of cheese, lard and stale eggs, filtered through the threshold. This was coming down in the world with a vengeance. But what James lost downstairs he tried to recover upstairs. Heaven knows what he would have done but for Miss Pinnegar. She kept her own workrooms against him, with a soft, heavy, silent tenacity that would have beaten stronger men than James. But his strength lay in his pliability. He rummaged in the empty lofts and among the discarded machinery. He rigged up the engines afresh, bought 2 new machines, and started an elastic department, making elastic for garters and for hat chins. He was immensely proud of his first cards of elastic, and saw Dame Fortune this time fast in his yielding hands. But becoming used to disillusionment, he almost welcomed it. Within 6 months he realised that every inch of elastic cost him exactly 60% more than he could sell it for, and so he scrapped his new department. Luckily he sold 1 machine and even gained £2 on it. After this he made one last effort. This was hosiery webbing, which could be cut up and made into as yet unheard of garments. Miss Pinnegar kept her thumb on this enterprise, so that it was not much more than abortive. And then James left her alone. Meanwhile the shop slowly churned its oddments. Every Thursday afternoon James sorted out tangles of bits and bobs, antique garments and occasional finds. With these he trimmed his window, so that it looked like a historical museum, rather soiled and scrappy. Indoors he made baskets of assortments, threepenny, sixpenny, ninepenny and shilling baskets, rather like a bran pie in which everything was a plum. And then on Friday evening, thin and alert, he hovered behind the counter, his coat shabbily buttoned over his narrow chest, his face agitated. He had shaved his side whiskers, so that they only grew becomingly as low as his ears. His rather large grey moustache was brushed off his mouth. His hair, gone very thin, was brushed frail and floating over his baldness. But still a gentleman, still courteous. With a charming voice he suggested the possibility of a pad of green parrot's tail feathers, or of a few yards of pink pearl trimming, or of old chenille fringe. The women would pinch the thick, exquisite old chenille fringe, delicate and faded, curious to feel its softness, but they wouldn't give threepence for it. Tapes, ribbons, braids, buttons, feathers, jabots, bustles, appliques, fringes, jet trimmings, bugle trimmings, bundles of old coloured machine lace, many bundles of strange cord in all colours for old-fashioned braid patterning, ribbons with HMS Birkenhead for boys' sailor caps. Everything that nobody wanted did the women turn over and over till they chanced on a find. And James' quick eyes watched the slow surge of his flotsam, as the pot boiled but did not boil away. Wonderful that he did not think of the days when these bits and bobs were new treasures, but he did not. And at his side Miss Pinnegar quietly took orders for shirts, discussed and agreed, made measurements and received instalments. The shop was now only opened on Friday afternoons and evenings, so every day, twice a day, James was seen dithering bareheaded and hastily down the street, as if pressed by fate, to the Conservative Club, and twice a day he was seen as hastily returning to his meals. He was becoming an old man, his daughter was a young woman, but in his own mind he was just the same, and his daughter was a little child, his wife a young invalid whom he must charm by some few delicate attentions, such as the peeled apple. At the club he got into more mischief. He met men who wanted to extend a brickfield down by the railway. The brickfield was called Klondyke. James had now a new direction to run in, downhill towards Bagthorpe, to Klondyke. Big penny daisies grew in tufts on the brink of the yellow clay at Klondyke. Yellow eggs and bacon spread their midsummer mats of flour. James came home with clay smeared all over him, discoursing brilliantly on grit and paste and presses and kilns and stamps. He carried home a rough and pinkish brick and gloated over it. It was a hard brick, it was a non-porous brick, it was an ugly brick, painfully heavy and parched looking. This time he was sure, Dame Fortune would rise like Persephone out of the earth. He was all the more sure because other men of the town were in with him at this venture, sound, moneyed grocers and plumbers. They were all going to become rich. Klondyke lasted a year and a half, and was not so bad, for in the end, all things considered, James had lost not more than 5% of his money. In fact, all things considered, he was about square. And yet he felt Klondyke as the greatest blow of all. Miss Pinnegar would have aided and abetted him in another scheme, if it would but have cheered him. Even Miss Frost was nice with him, but to no purpose. In the year after Klondyke he became an old man. He seemed to have lost all his feathers. He acquired a plucked, tottering look. Yet he roused up after a coal strike. Throttle Ha'penny put new life into him. During a coal strike the miners themselves began digging in the fields just near the houses for the surface coal. They found a plentiful seam of drossy, yellowish coal behind the Methodist New Connection chapel. The seam was opened in the side of a bank and approached by a foot-rill, a sloping shaft down which the men walked. When the strike was over, 2 or 3 miners still remained working the soft, drossy coal, which they sold for 8 and 6pence a ton, or 6pence a hundredweight. But a mining population scorned such dirt, as they called it. James Houghton, however, was seized with a desire to work the connection meadow seam, as he called it. He gathered 2 miner partners. He trotted endlessly up to the field. He talked, as he had never talked before, with innumerable colliers. Everybody he met he stopped to talk connection meadow. And so at last he sank a shaft 60 feet deep, rigged up a corrugated iron engine house with a winding engine, and lowered his men one at a time down the shaft in a big bucket. The whole affair was rickety, amateurish, and twopenny. The name Connection Meadow was forgotten within 3 months. Everybody knew the place as Throttle Ha'penny. "What?" said a collier to his wife. "Have we got no coal? You better get a bit from Throttle Ha'penny." "Nay," replied the wife, "I'm sure I shan't. I'm sure I shan't burn that muck and smother myself with white ash." It was in the early Throttle Ha'penny days that Mrs. Houghton died. James Houghton cried, and put a black band on his Sunday silk hat. But he was too feverishly busy at Throttle Ha'penny, selling his hundredweights of ash-pit fodder, as the natives called it, to realise anything else. He had 3 men and 2 boys working his pit, besides a superannuated old man driving the winding engine. And in spite of all jeering, he flourished. Shabby old coal carts rambled up behind the new connection and filled from the pit bank. The coal improved a little in quality. It was cheap and it was handy. James could sell at last 50 or 60 tons a week, for the stuff was easy getting. And now at last he was actually handling money. He saw millions ahead. This went on for more than a year. A year after the death of Mrs. Houghton, Miss Frost became ill and suddenly died. Again James Houghton cried and trembled. But it was Throttle Ha'penny that made him tremble. He trembled in all his limbs at the touch of success. He saw himself making noble provision for his only daughter. But alas, it is wearying to repeat the same thing over and over. First the Board of Trade began to make difficulties. Then there was a fault in the seam. Then the roof of Throttle Ha'penny was so loose and soft, James could not afford timber to hold it up. In short, when his daughter Alvina was about 27 years old, Throttle Ha'penny closed down. There was a sale of poor machinery, and James Houghton came home to the dark, gloomy house, to Miss Pinnegar and Alvina. It was a pinched, dreary house. James seemed down for the last time. But Miss Pinnegar persuaded him to take the shop again on Friday evening. For the rest, faded and peaked, he hurried shadowily down to the club. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Lost Girl by D.H.Lawrence. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Rise of Alvina Houghton. The heroine of this story is Alvina Houghton. If we leave her out of the first chapter of her own story, it is because, during the first 25 years of her life, she really was left out of count, or so overshadowed as to be negligible. She and her mother were the phantom passengers in the ship of James Houghton's fortunes. In Manchester House every voice lowered its tone, and so from the first Alvina spoke with a quiet, refined, almost convent voice. She was a thin child with delicate limbs and face, and wide, grey-blue, ironic eyes. Even as a small girl she had that odd ironic tilt of the eyelids which gave her a look as if she were hanging back in mockery. If she were, she was quite unaware of it, for under Miss Frost's care she received no education in irony or mockery. Miss Frost was straightforward, good-humoured, and a little earnest. Consequently, Alvina, or Vina as she was called, understood only the explicit mode of good-humoured straightforwardness. It was doubtful which shadow was greater over the child, that of Manchester House, gloomy and a little sinister, or that of Miss Frost, benevolent and protective. Sufficient that the girl herself worshipped Miss Frost, or believed she did. Alvina never went to school. She had her lessons from her beloved governess. She worked at the piano. she took her walks, and for social life she went to the Congregational Chapel, and to the functions connected with the chapel. While she was little, she went to Sunday school twice and to chapel once on Sundays. Then occasionally there was a magic lantern or a penny reading, to which Miss Frost accompanied her. As she grew older, she entered the choir at chapel. She attended Christian Endeavour and PSA and the Literary Society on Monday evenings. Chapel provided her with a whole social activity, in the course of which she met certain groups of people, made certain friends, found opportunity for strolls into the country and jaunts to the local entertainments. Over and above this, every Thursday evening she went to the subscription library to change the week's supply of books, and there again she met friends and acquaintances. It is hard to overestimate the value of church or chapel, but particularly chapel, as a social institution in places like Woodhouse. The Congregational Chapel provided Alvina with a whole outer life, lacking which she would have been poor indeed. She was not particularly religious by inclination. Perhaps her father's beautiful prayers put her off. So she neither questioned nor accepted, but just let be. She grew up a slim girl, rather distinguished in appearance, with a slender face, a fine, slightly arched nose, and beautiful grey-blue eyes over which the lids tilted with a very odd, sardonic tilt. The sardonic quality was, however, quite in abeyance. She was ladylike, not vehement at all. In the street her walk had a delicate, lingering motion, her face looked still. In conversation she had rather a quick, hurried manner, with intervals of well-bred repose and attention. Her voice was like her father's, flexible and curiously attractive. Sometimes, however, she would have fits of boisterous hilarity, not quite natural, with a strange note half pathetic, half jeering. Her father tended to a supercilious, sneering tone. In Vina it came out in mad bursts of hilarious jeering. This made Miss Frost uneasy. She would watch the girl's strange face, that could take on a gargoyle look. She would see the eyes rolling strangely under sardonic eyelids, and then Miss Frost would feel that never, never had she known anything so utterly alien and incomprehensible and unsympathetic as her own beloved Vina. For 20 years the strong protective governess reared and tended her lamb, her dove, only to see the lamb open a wolf's mouth, to hear the dove utter the wild cackle of a daw or a magpie, a strange sound of derision. At such times Miss Frost's heart went cold within her. She dared not realise, and she chid and checked her ward, restored her to the usual impulsive, affectionate demureness. Then she dismissed the whole matter. It was just an accidental aberration on the girl's part from her own true nature. Miss Frost taught Alvina thoroughly the qualities of her own true nature, and Alvina believed what she was taught. She remained for 20 years the demure, refined creature of her governess's desire. But there was an odd, derisive look at the back of her eyes, a look of old knowledge and deliberate derision. She herself was unconscious of it, but it was there, and this it was, perhaps, that scared away the young men. Alvina reached the age of 23, and it looked as if she were destined to join the ranks of the old maids, so many of whom found cold comfort in the chapel. For she had no suitors. True, there were extraordinarily few young men of her class, for whatever her condition she had certain breeding and inherent culture, in Woodhouse. The young men of the same social standing as herself were in some curious way outsiders to her. Knowing nothing, yet her ancient sapience went deep, deeper than Woodhouse could fathom. The young men did not like her for it. They did not like the tilt of her eyelids. Miss Frost, with anxious foreseeing, persuaded the girl to take over some pupils, to teach them the piano. The work was distasteful to Alvina. She was not a good teacher. She persevered in an off-hand way, somewhat indifferent, albeit dutiful. When she was 23 years old, Alvina met a man called Graham. He was an Australian, who had been in Edinburgh taking his medical degree. Before going back to Australia, he came to spend some months practising with old Dr. Fordham in Woodhouse, Dr. Fordham being in some way connected with his mother. Alexander Graham called to see Mrs. Houghton. Mrs. Houghton did not like him. She said he was creepy. He was a man of medium height, dark in colouring, with very dark eyes, and a body which seemed to move inside his clothing. He was amiable and polite, laughed often, showing his teeth. It was his teeth which Miss Frost could not stand. She seemed to see a strong mouthful of cruel, compact teeth. She declared he had dark blood in his veins, that he was not a man to be trusted, and that never, never would he make any woman's life happy. Yet in spite of all, Alvina was attracted by him. The two would stay together in the parlour, laughing and talking by the hour. What they could find to talk about was a mystery. Yet there they were, laughing and chatting, with a running, insinuating sound through it all, which made Miss Frost pace up and down, unable to bear herself. The man was always running in when Miss Frost was out. He contrived to meet Alvina in the evening, to take a walk with her. He went a long walk with her one night, and wanted to make love to her. But her upbringing was too strong for her. "Oh no," she said, "we are only friends." He knew her upbringing was too strong for him also. "We're more than friends," he said. "We're more than friends." "I don't think so," she said. "Yes, we are," he insisted, trying to put his arm round her waist. "Oh don't," she cried. "Let us go home." And then he burst out with wild and thick protestations of love, which thrilled her and repelled her slightly. "Anyhow, I must tell Miss Frost," she said. "Yes, yes," he answered. "Yes, yes, let us be engaged at once." As they passed under the lamps he saw her face lifted, the eyes shining, the delicate nostrils dilated, as of one who scents battle and laughs to herself. She seemed to laugh with a certain proud, sinister recklessness. His hands trembled with desire. So they were engaged. He bought her a ring, an emerald set in tiny diamonds. Miss Frost looked grave and silent, but would not openly deny her approval. "You like him, don't you? You don't dislike him?" Alvina insisted. "I don't dislike him," replied Miss Frost. "How can I? He's a perfect stranger to me." And with this Alvina subtly contented herself. Her father treated the young man with suave attention, punctuated by fits of jerky hostility and jealousy. Her mother merely sighed, and took sal volatile. To tell the truth, Alvina herself was a little repelled by the man's love-making. She found him fascinating, but a trifle repulsive. And she was not sure whether she hated the repulsive element, or whether she rather gloried in it. She kept her look of arch, half-derisive recklessness, which was so unbearably painful to Miss Frost, and so exciting to the dark little man. It was a strange look in a refined, really virgin girl, oddly sinister. And her voice had a curious, bronze-like resonance that acted straight on the nerves of her hearers, unpleasantly on most English nerves, but like fire on the different susceptibilities of the young man, the darky, as people called him. But after all, he had only 6 weeks in England before sailing to Sydney. He suggested that he and Alvina should marry before he sailed. Miss Frost would not hear of it. He must see his people first, she said. So the time passed, and he sailed. Alvina missed him, missed the extreme excitement of him rather than the human being he was. Miss Frost set to work to regain her influence over her ward, to remove that arch, reckless, almost lewd look from the girl's face. It was a question of heart against sensuality. Miss Frost tried and tried to wake again the girl's loving heart, which loving heart was certainly not occupied by that man. It was a hard task, an anxious, bitter task Miss Frost had set herself. But at last she succeeded. Alvina seemed to thaw. The hard shining of her eyes softened again to a sort of demureness and tenderness. The influence of the man was revoked. The girl was left uninhabited, empty and uneasy. She was due to follow her Alexander in 3 months' time to Sydney. Came letters from him, en route, and then a cablegram from Australia. He had arrived. Alvina should have been preparing her trousseau to follow, but owing to her change of heart, she lingered indecisive. "Do you love him, dear?" said Miss Frost with emphasis, knitting her thick, passionate, earnest eyebrows. "Do you love him sufficiently? That's the point." The way Miss Frost put the question implied that Alvina did not and could not love him, because Miss Frost could not. Alvina lifted her large blue eyes, confused, half tender towards her governess, half shining with unconscious derision. "I don't really know," she said, laughing hurriedly. "I don't really." Miss Frost scrutinised her, and replied with a meaningful "Well?" To Miss Frost it was clear as daylight, to Alvina not so. In her periods of lucidity, when she saw as clear as daylight also, she certainly did not love the little man. She felt him a terrible outsider, an inferior, to tell the truth. She wondered how he could have the slightest attraction for her. In fact, she could not understand it at all. She was as free of him as if he had never existed. The square green emerald on her finger was almost nonsensical. She was quite sure of herself. And then, most irritating, a complete volte-face in her feelings. The clear as daylight mood disappeared as daylight is bound to disappear. She found herself in a night where the little man loomed large, terribly large, potent and magical, while Miss Frost had dwindled to nothingness. At such times she wished with all her force that she could travel like a cablegram to Australia. She felt it was the only way. She felt the dark, passionate receptivity of Alexander overwhelmed her, enveloped her even from the Antipodes. She felt herself going distracted. She felt she was going out of her mind, for she could not act. Her mother and Miss Frost were fixed in one line. Her father said: "Well, of course you'll do as you think best. There's a great risk in going so far, a great risk. You would be entirely unprotected." "I don't mind being unprotected," said Alvina perversely. "Because you don't understand what it means," said her father. He looked at her quickly. Perhaps he understood her better than the others. "Personally," said Miss Pinnegar, speaking of Alexander, "I don't care for him. But every one has their own taste." Alvina felt she was being overborne, and that she was letting herself be overborne. She was half relieved. She seemed to nestle into the well-known surety of Woodhouse. The other unknown had frightened her. Miss Frost now took a definite line. "I feel you don't love him, dear. I'm almost sure you don't. So now you have to choose. Your mother dreads your going, she dreads it. I'm certain you would never see her again. She says she can't bear it. She can't bear the thought of you out there with Alexander. It makes her shudder. She suffers dreadfully, you know. So you will have to choose, dear. You will have to choose for the best." Alvina was made stubborn by pressure. She herself had come fully to believe that she did not love him. She was quite sure she did not love him. But out of a certain perversity, she wanted to go. Came his letter from Sydney, and one from his parents to her and one to her parents. All seemed straightforward, not very cordial, but sufficiently. Over Alexander's letter Miss Frost shed bitter tears. To her it seemed so shallow and heartless, with terms of endearment stuck in like exclamation marks. He seemed to have no thought, no feeling for the girl herself. All he wanted was to hurry her out there. He did not even mention the grief of her parting from her English parents and friends. Not a word. Just a rush to get her out there, winding up with, "And now, dear, I shall not be myself till I see you here in Sydney. Your ever-loving Alexander." A selfish, sensual creature who would forget the dear little Vina in 3 months if she did not turn up, and who would neglect her in 6 months if she did. Probably Miss Frost was right. Alvina knew the tears she was costing all round. She went upstairs and looked at his photograph, his dark and impertinent muzzle. Who was he, after all? She did not know him. With cold eyes she looked at him, and found him repugnant. She went across to her governess's room and found Miss Frost in a strange mood of trepidation. "Don't trust me, dear, don't trust what I say," poor Miss Frost ejaculated hurriedly, even wildly. Don't notice what I have said. Act for yourself, dear. Act for yourself entirely. I'm sure I am wrong in trying to influence you. I know I am wrong. It is wrong and foolish of me. Act just for yourself, dear. The rest doesn't matter. The rest doesn't matter. Don't take any notice of what I have said. I know I am wrong." For the first time in her life Alvina saw her beloved governess flustered, the beautiful white hair looking a little draggled, the grey, near-sighted eyes, so deep and kind behind the gold-rimmed glasses, now distracted and scared. Alvina immediately burst into tears and flung herself into the arms of Miss Frost. Miss Frost also cried as if her heart would break, catching her indrawn breath with a strange sound of anguish, forlornness, the terrible crying of a woman with a loving heart, whose heart has never been able to relax. Alvina was hushed. In a second she became the elder of the two. The terrible poignancy of the woman of 52 who now at last had broken down, silenced the girl of 23, and roused all her passionate tenderness. The terrible sound of "Never now, never now, it is too late," which seemed to ring in the curious, indrawn cries of the elder woman, filled the girl with a deep wisdom. She knew the same would ring in her mother's dying cry. Married or unmarried, it was the same anguish, realized in all its pain after the age of 50, the loss in never having been able to relax, to submit. Alvina felt very strong and rich in the fact of her youth. For her it was not too late. For Miss Frost it was for ever too late. "I don't want to go, dear," said Alvina to the elder woman. "I know I don't care for him. He is nothing to me." Miss Frost became gradually silent, and turned aside her face. After this there was a hush in the house. Alvina announced her intention of breaking off her engagement. Her mother kissed her and cried and said, with the selfishness of an invalid, "I couldn't have parted with you, I couldn't," whilst the father said, "I think you are wise, Vina. I have thought a lot about it." So Alvina packed up his ring and his letters and little presents, and posted them over the seas. She was relieved really, as if she had escaped some very trying ordeal. For some days she went about happily, in pure relief. She loved everybody. She was charming and sunny and gentle with everybody, particularly with Miss Frost, whom she loved with a deep, tender, rather sore love. Poor Miss Frost seemed to have lost a part of her confidence, to have taken on a new wistfulness, a new silence and remoteness. It was as if she found her busy contact with life a strain now. Perhaps she was getting old. Perhaps her proud heart had given way. Alvina had kept a little photograph of the man. She would often go and look at it. Love? No, it was not love. It was something more primitive still. It was curiosity, deep, radical, burning curiosity. How she looked and looked at his dark, impertinent-seeming face. A flicker of derision came into her eyes, yet still she looked. In the same manner she would look into the faces of the young men of Woodhouse. But she never found there what she found in her photograph. They all seemed like blank sheets of paper in comparison. There was a curious, pale, surface look in the faces of the young men of Woodhouse. Or, if there was some underneath suggestive power, it was a little abject or humiliating, inferior, common. They were all either blank or common. End of Chapter 2. Read by Tony Foster. Chapter 3 of The Lost Girl by D.H.Lawrence. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The maternity nurse. Of course Alvina made everybody pay for her mood of submission and sweetness. In a month's time she was quite intolerable. "I can't stay here all my life," she declared, stretching her eyes in a way that irritated the other inmates of Manchester House extremely. "I know I can't. I can't bear it. I simply can't bear it, and there's an end of it. I can't. I tell you I can't bear it. I'm buried alive. Simply buried alive. And it's more than I can stand. It is, really." There was an odd clang, like a taunt in her voice. She was trying them all. "But what do you want, dear?" asked Miss Frost, knitting her dark brows in agitation. "I want to go away," said Alvina bluntly. Miss Frost gave a slight gesture with her right hand, of helpless impatience. It was so characteristic that Alvina almost laughed. "But where do you want to go?" "I don't know. I don't care," said Alvina. "Anywhere, if I can get out of Woodhouse." "Do you wish you'd gone to Australia?" put in Miss Pinnegar. "No, I don't wish I'd gone to Australia," retorted Alvina with a rude laugh. "Australia isn't the only other place beside Woodhouse." Miss Pinnegar was naturally offended. But the curious insolence which sometimes came out in the girl was inherited direct from her father. "You see, dear," said Miss Frost, agitated, "if you knew what you wanted, it would be easier to see the way." "I want to be a nurse," rapped out Alvina. Miss Frost stood still, with the stillness of a middle-aged, disapproving woman, and looked at her charge. She believed that Alvina was just speaking at random, yet she dared not check her, in her present mood. Alvina was indeed speaking at random. She had never thought of being a nurse. The idea had never entered her head. If it had, she would certainly never have entertained it. But she had heard Alexander speak of nurse this and sister that, and so she had rapped out her declaration. And having rapped it out, she prepared herself to stick to it. Nothing like leaping before you look. "A nurse!" repeated Miss Frost. "But do you feel yourself fitted to be a nurse? Do you think you could bear it?" "Yes, I'm sure I could," retorted Alvina. "I want to be a maternity nurse." She looked strangely, even outrageously, at her governess. "I want to be a maternity nurse. Then I shouldn't have to attend operations." And she laughed quickly. Miss Frost's right hand beat like a wounded bird. It was reminiscent of the way she beat time, insistently, when she was giving music lessons, sitting close beside her pupils at the piano. Now it beat without time or reason. Alvina smiled brightly and cruelly. "Whatever put such an idea into your head, Vina?" asked poor Miss Frost. "I don't know," said Alvina, still more archly and brightly. "Of course you don't mean it, dear," said Miss Frost, quailing. "Yes, I do. Why should I say it if I don't?" Miss Frost would have done anything to escape the arch, bright, cruel eyes of her charge. "Then we must think about it," she said numbly, and she went away. Alvina floated off to her room and sat by the window looking down on the street. The bright arch look was still on her face, but her heart was sore. She wanted to cry and fling herself on the breasts of her darling, but she couldn't. No, for her life she couldn't. Some little devil sat in her breast and kept her smiling archly. Somewhat to her amazement, he sat steadily on for days and days. Every minute she expected him to go. Every minute she expected to break down, to burst into tears and tenderness and reconciliation. But no, she did not break down. She persisted. They all waited for the old loving Vina to be herself again. But the new and recalcitrant Vina still shone hard. She found a copy of the Lancet, and saw an advertisement of a home in Islington, where maternity nurses would be fully trained and equipped in 6 months' time. The fee was 60 guineas. Alvina declared her intention of departing to this training home. She had £200 of her own, bequeathed by her grandfather. In Manchester House they were all horrified. Not moved with grief this time, but shocked. It seemed such a repulsive and indelicate step to take, which it was, and which, in her curious perverseness, Alvina must have intended it to be. Mrs. Houghton assumed a remote air of silence, as if she did not hear any more, did not belong. She lapsed far away. She was really very weak. Miss Pinnegar said, "Well, really, if she wants to do it, why, she might as well try." And, as often with Miss Pinnegar, this speech seemed to contain a veiled threat. "A maternity nurse?" said James Houghton. "A maternity nurse? What exactly do you mean by a maternity nurse?" "A trained midwife," said Miss Pinnegar curtly. "That's it, isn't it? It is, as far as I can see. A trained midwife." "Yes, of course," said Alvina brightly. "But—" stammered James Houghton, pushing his spectacles up onto his forehead, and making his long fleece of painfully thin hair uncover his baldness. "I can't understand that any young girl of any upbringing whatever, should want to choose such an occupation. I can't understand it." "Can't you?" said Alvina brightly. "Oh well, if she does," said Miss Pinnegar cryptically. Miss Frost said very little. But she had serious confidential talks with Dr. Fordham. Dr. Fordham didn't approve, certainly he didn't, but neither did he see any great harm in it. At that time it was rather the thing for young ladies to enter the nursing profession, if their hopes had been blighted or checked in another direction. And so enquiries were made. The upshot was that Alvina was to go to Islington for her 6 months' training. There was a great bustle preparing her nursing outfit. Instead of a trousseau, nurses' uniforms in fine blue and white stripe with great white aprons. Instead of a wreath of orange blossom, a rather chic nurse's bonnet of blue silk, and, for a trailing veil, a blue silk fall. Well and good. Alvina expected to become frightened as the time drew near, but no, she wasn't a bit frightened. Miss Frost watched her narrowly. Would there not be a return of the old, tender, sensitive, shrinking Vina? The exquisitely sensitive and nervous, loving girl? No. Astounding as it may seem, there was no return of such a creature. Alvina remained bright and ready. The half-hilarious clang remained in her voice, taunting. She kissed them all good-bye, brightly and sprightlily, and off she set. She wasn't nervous. She came to St. Pancras, she got her cab, she drove off to her destination, and, as she drove, she looked out of the window. Horrid, vast, stony, dilapidated, crumbly stuccoed streets and squares of Islington, grey, greyer by far than Woodhouse, and interminable. How exceedingly sordid and disgusting! But instead of being repelled and heartbroken, Alvina enjoyed it. She felt her trunk rumble on top of the cab, and still she looked out on the ghastly, dilapidated, flat facades of Islington, and still she smiled brightly, as if there were some charm in it all. Perhaps for her there was a charm in it all. Perhaps it acted like a tonic on the little devil in her breast. Perhaps, if she had seen tufts of snowdrops, it was February, and yew hedges and cottage windows, she would have broken down. As it was, she just enjoyed it. She enjoyed glimpsing in through uncurtained windows, into sordid rooms where human beings moved as if sordidly unaware. She enjoyed the smell of a toasted bloater, rather burnt. So common! So indescribably common! And she detested bloaters, because of the hairy feel of the spines in her mouth. But to smell them like this, to know that she was in the region of penny beefsteaks, gave her a perverse pleasure. The cab stopped at a yellow house at the corner of a square where some shabby bare trees were flecked with bits of blown paper. Bits of paper and refuse cluttered inside the round railings of each tree. She went up some dirty yellowish steps and rang the patient's bell, because she knew she ought not to ring the tradesman's. A servant, not exactly dirty, but unattractive, let her into a hall painted a dull drab, and floored with cocoa matting, otherwise bare. Then up bare stairs to a room where a stout, pale, common woman with 2 warts on her face was drinking tea. It was 3 o'clock. This was the matron. The matron soon deposited her in a bedroom not very small but bare and hard and dusty seeming, and there left her. Alvina sat down on her chair, looked at her box opposite, looked round the uninviting room and smiled to herself. Then she rose and went to the window, a very dirty window, looking down into a sort of well of an area, with other wells ranging along, and straight opposite, like a reflection, another solid range of back premises, with iron stairways and horrid little doors, and washing, and little WC's, and people creeping up and down like vermin. Alvina shivered a little, but still smiled. Then slowly she began to take off her hat. She put it down on the drab-painted chest of drawers. Presently the servant came in with a tray, set it down, lit a naked gas jet which roared faintly, and drew down a crackly dark green blind, which showed a tendency to fly back again alertly to the ceiling. "Thank you," said Alvina, and the girl departed. Then Miss Houghton drank her black tea, and ate her bread and margarine. Surely enough books have been written about heroines in similar circumstances. There is no need to go into the details of Alvina's 6 months in Islington. The food was objectionable, yet Alvina got fat on it. The air was filthy, and yet never had her colour been so warm and fresh, her skin so soft. Her companions were almost without exception vulgar and coarse, yet never had she got on so well with women of her own age, or older than herself. She was ready with a laugh and a word, and though she was unable to venture on indecencies herself, yet she had an amazing faculty for looking knowing and indecent beyond words, rolling her eyes and pitching her eyebrows in a certain way. Oh, it was quite sufficient for her companions. And yet, if they had ever actually demanded a dirty story or a really open indecency from her, she would have been floored. But she enjoyed it. Amazing how she enjoyed it. She did not care how revolting and indecent these nurses were, she put on a look as if she were in with it all, and it all passed off as easy as winking. She swung her haunches and arched her eyes with the best of them, and they behaved as if she were exactly one of themselves. And yet, with the curious cold tact of women, they left her alone, one and all, in private, just ignored her. It is truly incredible how Alvina became blooming and bouncing at this time. Nothing shocked her, nothing upset her. She was always ready with her hard nurse's laugh and her nurse's quips. No one was better than she at double entendre. No one could better give the nurse's leer. She had it all in a fortnight. And never once did she feel anything but exhilarated and in full swing. It seemed to her she had not a moment's time to brood or reflect about things. She was too much in the swing. Every moment, in the swing, living, or active, in full swing. When she got into bed she went to sleep. When she awoke it was morning, and she got up. As soon as she was up and dressed she had somebody to answer, somebody to say, something to do. Time passed like an express train, and she seemed to have known no other life than this. Not far away was a lying-in hospital, a dreadful place it was. There she had to go right off and help with cases. There she had to attend lectures and demonstrations. There she met the doctors and students. Well, a pretty lot they were, one way and another. When she had put on flesh and become pink and bouncing, she was just their sort, just their very ticket. Her voice had the right twang, her eyes the right roll, her haunches the right swing. She seemed altogether just the ticket. And yet she wasn't. It would be useless to say she was not shocked. She was profoundly and awfully shocked. Her whole state was perhaps largely the result of shock, a sort of play-acting based on hysteria. But the dreadful things she saw in the lying-in hospital and afterwards went deep, and finished her youth and her tutelage for ever. How many infernos, deeper than Miss Frost could ever know, did she not travel? The inferno of the human animal, the human organism in its convulsions, the human social beast in its abjection and its degradation. For in her latter half she had to visit the slum cases, and such cases! A woman lying on a bare, filthy floor, a few old coats thrown over her, and vermin crawling everywhere in spite of sanitary inspectors. But what did the woman, the sufferer, herself care? She ground her teeth and screamed and yelled with pains. In her calm periods she lay stupid and indifferent. Or she cursed a little. But abject, stupid indifference was the bottom of it all. Abject, brutal indifference to everything. Yes, everything. Just a piece of female functioning, no more. Alvina was supposed to receive a certain fee for these cases she attended in their homes. A small proportion of her fee she kept for herself, the rest she handed over to the home. That was the agreement. She received her grudged fee callously, threatened and exacted it when it was not forthcoming. Ha! If they didn't have to pay you at all, these slum people, they would treat you with more contempt than if you were one of themselves. It was one of the hardest lessons Alvina had to learn, to bully these people, in their own hovels, into some sort of obedience to her commands, and some sort of respect for her presence. She had to fight tooth and nail for this end. And in a week she was as hard and callous to them as they to her. And so her work was well done. She did not hate them. There they were. They had a certain life, and you had to take them at their own worth in their own way. What else? If one should be gentle, one was gentle. The difficulty did not lie there. The difficulty lay in being sufficiently rough and hard. That was the trouble. It cost a great struggle to be hard and callous enough. Glad she would have been to be allowed to treat them quietly and gently, with consideration. But pah! It was not their line. They wanted to be callous, and if you were not callous to match, they made a fool of you and prevented your doing your work. Was Alvina her own real self all this time? The mighty question arises upon us, what is one's own real self? It certainly is not what we think we are and ought to be. Alvina had been bred to think of herself as a delicate, tender, chaste creature, with unselfish inclinations and a pure, high mind. Well, so she was, in the more or less exhausted part of herself. But high-mindedness had really come to an end with James Houghton, had really reached the point, not only of pathetic, but of dry and anti-human, repulsive quixotry. In Alvina high-mindedness was already stretched beyond the breaking point. Being a woman of some flexibility of temper, wrought through generations to a fine, pliant hardness, she flew back. She went right back on high-mindedness. Did she thereby betray it? We think not. If we turn over the head of the penny and look at the tail, we don't thereby deny or betray the head. We do but adjust it to its own complement. And so with high-mindedness. It is but one side of the medal, the crowned reverse. On the obverse, the three legs still go kicking the soft-footed spin of the universe, the dolphin flirts and the crab leers. So Alvina spun her medal, and her medal came down tails. Heads or tails? Heads for generations, then tails. See the poetic justice. Now Alvina decided to accept the decision of her fate. Or rather, being sufficiently a woman, she didn't decide anything. She was her own fate. She went through her training experiences like another being. She was not herself, said everybody. When she came home to Woodhouse at Easter, in her bonnet and cloak, everybody was simply knocked out. Imagine that this frail, pallid, diffident girl, so ladylike, was now a rather fat, warm-coloured young woman, strapping and strong-looking, and with a certain bounce. Imagine her mother's startled, almost expiring, "Why, Vina, dear!" Vina laughed. She knew how they were all feeling. "At least it agrees with your health," said her father, sarcastically, to which Miss Pinnegar answered, "Well, that's a good deal." But Miss Frost said nothing the first day. Only the second day, at breakfast, as Alvina ate rather rapidly and rather well, the white-haired woman said quietly, with a tinge of cold contempt, "How changed you are, dear." "Am I?" laughed Alvina. "Oh, not really." And she gave the arch look with her eyes which made Miss Frost shudder. Inwardly, Miss Frost shuddered and abstained from questioning. Alvina was always speaking of the doctors, Dr. Young and Dr. Headley and Dr. James. She spoke of theatres and music-halls with these young men, and the jolly good time she had with them. And her blue-grey eyes seemed to have become harder and greyer, lighter somehow. In her wistfulness and her tender pathos, Alvina's eyes would deepen their blue, so beautiful. And now, in her floridity, they were bright and arch and light grey. The deep, tender, flowery blue was gone for ever. They were luminous and crystalline, like the eyes of a changeling. Miss Frost shuddered and abstained from question. She wanted, she needed, to ask of her charge, "Alvina, have you betrayed yourself with any of these young men?" But coldly her heart abstained from asking, or even from seriously thinking. She left the matter untouched for the moment. She was already too much shocked. Certainly Alvina represented the young doctors as very nice, but rather fast young fellows. My word, you have to have your wits about you with them! Imagine such a speech from a girl tenderly nurtured, a speech uttered in her own home, and accompanied by a florid laugh, which would lead a chaste, generous woman like Miss Frost to imagine—well, she merely abstained from imagining anything. She had that strength of mind. She never for one moment attempted to answer the question to herself as to whether Alvina had betrayed herself with any of these young doctors or not. The question remained stated but completely unanswered, coldly awaiting its answer. Only when Miss Frost kissed Alvina good-bye at the station, tears came to her eyes, and she said hurriedly, in a low voice: "Remember we are all praying for you, dear." "No, don't do that," cried Alvina involuntarily, without knowing what she said. And then the train moved out, and she saw her darling standing there on the station, the pale, well-modelled face looking out from behind the gold-rimmed spectacles, wistfully, the strong, rather stout figure standing very still and unchangeable under its coat and skirt of dark purple, the white hair glistening under the folded dark hat. Alvina threw herself down on the seat of her carriage. She loved her darling. She would love her through eternity. She knew she was right, amply and beautifully right, her darling, her beloved Miss Frost. Eternally and gloriously right. And yet, it was a right which was fulfilled. There were other rights. There was another side to the medal. Purity and high-mindedness, the beautiful but unbearable tyranny. The beautiful unbearable tyranny of Miss Frost! It was time now for Miss Frost to die. It was time for that perfected flower to be gathered to immortality, a lovely immortelle. But an obstruction to other, purple and carmine blossoms which were in bud on the stem. A lovely edelweiss, but time it was gathered into eternity. Black purple and red anemones were due, real Adonis blood. And strange individual orchids, spotted and fantastic. Time for Miss Frost to die. She, Alvina, who loved her as no one else would ever love her, with that love which goes to the core of the universe, knew that it was time for her darling to be folded, oh, so gently and softly, into immortality. Mortality was busy with the day after her day. It was time for Miss Frost to die. As Alvina sat motionless in the train, running from Woodhouse to Tibshelf, it decided itself in her. She was glad to be back in Islington, among all the horrors of her confinement cases. The doctors she knew hailed her. On the whole, these young men had not any too deep respect for the nurses as a whole. Why drag in respect? Human functions were too obviously established to make any great fuss about. And so the doctors put their arms around Alvina's waist, because she was plump, and they kissed her face because the skin was soft, and she laughed and squirmed a little, so that they felt all the more her warmth and softness under their arms' pressure. "It's no use, you know," she said, laughing, rather breathless, but looking into their eyes with a curious, definite look of unchangeable resistance. This only piqued them. "What's no use?" they asked. She shook her head slightly. "It isn't any use your behaving like that with me," she said, with the same challenging definiteness, finality, a flat negative. "Who are you telling?" they said. For she did not at all forbid them to behave like that. Not in the least. She almost encouraged them. She laughed and arched her eyes and flirted. But her backbone became only the stronger and firmer. Soft and supple as she was, her backbone never yielded for an instant. It could not. She had to confess that she liked the young doctors. They were alert, their faces were clean and bright looking. She liked the sort of intimacy with them, when they kissed her and wrestled with her in the empty laboratories or corridors, often in the intervals of most critical and appalling cases. She liked their arm around her waist, the kisses as she reached back her face, straining away, the sometimes desperate struggles. They took unpardonable liberties. They pinched her haunches and attacked her in unheard of ways. Sometimes her blood really came up in the fight, and she felt as if with her hands she could tear any man, any male creature limb from limb. A superhuman, voltaic force filled her. For a moment she surged in massive, inhuman, female strength. The men always wilted. And invariably when they wilted, she touched them with a sudden gentle touch, pitying. So that she always remained friends with them. When her curious, Amazonic power left her again, and she was just a mere woman, she made shy eyes at them once more, and treated them with the inevitable female-to-male homage. The men liked her. They cocked their eyes at her when she was not looking, and wondered at her. They wondered over her. They had been beaten by her, every one of them, but they did not openly know it. They looked at her as if she were woman itself, some creature not quite personal. What they noticed, all of them, was the way her brown hair looped over her ears. There was something chaste and noble and warlike about it. The remote quality which hung about her in the midst of her intimacies and her frequencies, nothing high or lofty, but something given to the struggle and as yet invincible in the struggle, made them seek her out. They felt safe with her. They knew she would not let them down. She would not intrigue into marriage or try to make use of them in any